Okay, so guess that maybe I'll start here. So just some reminders. If you haven't already, complete all the assignments in that Unit 0 module to unlock the rest of the course. The rest of the course includes things like the ICA assignments. Remember, these activities are Canvas-based activities that are meant to help you through the reading. There's a very generous drop policy. I think it's at least 5. So, given that we only have 15 weeks in the course, so I forget how many units ends up being. Maybe it's like 13 units, and so each one of them has like roughly 1 ICA. So it's almost half of them. So it's this is not something that's intended to be a lot of work for you every single week. But that said, this ICA is very short, and I wouldn't recommend that this would be one of the ones that you drop. I think it'll be very quick for you to complete this ICA right here. So definitely encourage you to do that. It's named ICA A2, so remember that naming convention, and all the due dates are on the Canvas calendar, but that naming convention means that it is due before lecture A2. So lecture A2 is Thursday, so it'll be due Wednesday night. So that's how that works there. Lab 1 this week. So the labs were yesterday and today. I think very few people showed up at yesterday's lab session. That's totally fine. Lab 1 is going over the same things that your first homework will be going over. So hand simulation and just generally how to start building out the elements of a discrete event system simulation model. So that's stuff that is covered in the Lab 1 lecture. It'll also be covered in the stuff that we'll be talking about this week and next week. So you'll see a lot of that being rehashed. So if you would like help with that, then that's what the lab sessions are there for. So feel free to show up in that, and the TA can help you. Surrey can help you with, if you're having trouble figuring out the difference between an activity and a delay and all these sorts of things, then I definitely encourage you to do that. But if you are totally fine with that lab assignment on your own, which is due Sunday, then that's fine too. Then you don't have to show up, and you can make better use of that time doing something else. So like I said, this will be very similar to this first half of homework B1. That homework is available if you want to take a look at it. But that naming convention, B1, indicates that the homework is meant to be released after lecture B1, which will be a week from today. So in theory, you'll have all of the material you need to complete homework B1 on Tuesday, a week from today, but it's already available. I think the first maybe 3 homeworks are already available, but of course their due dates are far in the future. But if you want to get a head start on those, then feel free to take a look. So all the labs are also available. The only thing that's not, I think the last 2, maybe 3 homeworks, there's only, I think, 5 homeworks. So either the last 2 or 3, I still need to update for this semester. But I think otherwise, all of the assignments are available for those who want to look ahead. All right, so I guess I'll go back to here. Any questions? Okay, hopefully pretty clear. So as mentioned before, I didn't bring it up, the poll everywhere, but I'll try to do that the next time. But still, if you do have a question that you just want to get down, normally I'll have the poll everywhere up, so I'll be able to monitor it during the lecture. But otherwise, when it's not up, I will take a look at this after class, and then any unresolved questions I can resolve in the discussion or the announcement. So of course, you can just raise a hand, and that's fine too. But those who would prefer to be anonymous, then feel free to use that. Okay, so today we are, introduction to modeling. That's what this course is about. It's a simulation modeling course. So to figure out, what is modeling. And so, to kind of set that up, a quick, I always hated it when faculty give backgrounds because I just don't care as a student, right? But my basic background, which I'm trying to use as a foundation here, is that back, many decades ago, I was a software engineer, and I worked in telecom and networking and open source software development, and then decided that I wanted to then become an electrical engineer. And actually, that was back before cell phones were really a big thing. It was kind of magic, this idea of wireless communication and all the great things it would do. And that really motivated me to be a double E. So I went into double E, and when I learned how antennas worked, it kind of took all the magic out of it, but it allowed me to learn about electronics. And through electronics, I learned about feedback compensation. And that was what made me really excited about control theory. So I became a control theorist. And as I moved into my graduate work, I found out that control theory could actually learn about how to build new automation systems by looking at natural systems. And so studied how fish breed and how birds cache things in the forest and used those to build algorithms that would run on automation systems like flying vehicles and ground vehicles, little robot vacuums and things like that that would mimic what animals would do. And so that got me really sort of interested in this intersection between biology and engineering. So I became a postdoc and first in CS, where I kind of pulled back some of my old software engineering and it sort of picked up more formal methods for how to do verification problems when you're in these kind of cyber physical systems I was working in. And then the important thing then was my final postdoc before being a faculty member was then to learn how to work in a wet lab. And so, and that led me to here, where now I think I'm the only one in Sky with a wet lab. And so, my background combines, a lot of double E, computer science, and then empirical work, actually working. I do a lot of work with ants nowadays. So I was just in Australia over the summer, spending a month there collecting green tree weaver ants and doing experiments with them in the field. And now we've got them back in the lab here. So it's not maybe the most traditional path. There's no formal industrial engineering here, but it is my claim that actually this combination of engineering and science was actually set me up pretty well for teaching industrial engineering courses and for working in industrial engineering, and that's kind of foreshadowing for what I'm getting in here. But before we get to that, then I sort of want to ask you, what do you think industrial engineering is? Do you have a good definition? If people were to ask, what is an IE? What do you tell them? The 400 level course, so yeah. Eliminating waste, so something about optimization or minimizing waste. So that's an interesting answer. I think optimization is definitely one that's kind of in there. Anybody else have anything else that they would offer for what an IE does or is? How is an IE different from a chemi or a double E or a mechie? Any other thoughts? Yeah. So optimizing kind of goes along with that. I heard a voice over here too. That's an interesting perspective. So if you didn't hear that, they deal more with systems. And so it's the combinations of things as opposed to sort of a targeted, something that's maybe more specific. And so it's putting things together more than trying to build things up from, maybe a more narrow kind of focus there. And I like that definition as well. So let's keep those in mind and let's broaden it a little bit more and say, what is the difference between science and engineering? Not industrial engineering, just engineering in general. So how do we know that some of the scientists are an engineer? What differentiates them? You thought, yeah, theory and practice. So I guess so. Science would maybe be theory and engineering practice. Is that the thought? I thought I liked. I feel that that's got something there. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Yeah. So I hear science is about discovering things that already exist, and engineering is more like building new things, creating. I think there's something interesting then to that definition too. I think that's a very good perspective. Anybody else? Yeah. Interesting. So the thought there was science is about testing a hypothesis, making an inference about the natural world, whereas engineering is not so much about discovering something about the natural world, but to build something new. It's going back to the building idea to add something to the world. I think that's also and I think all these definitions kind of fit in together. And I think, so if we were to look at like, the dictionary definition of science, I think it goes along with this kind of idea. Such knowledge or a system of knowledge concerned with the physical world and its phenomena. So a scientist grows the body of knowledge about the natural world by making inferences from data gathered. So the scientist goes out and does experiments, gathers data, and then says, from that data, this is most likely the process that best fits what we think is going on in the natural world. And then that becomes knowledge. And then that knowledge could be used, and maybe it could be used by engineers. So the application of science and mathematics by which the properties of matter and the sources of energy in nature are made useful to people. I like that phrase, useful to people. So an engineer is a consumer of scientific knowledge. It uses knowledge about the natural world to construct new things that, again, you're useful. And what do you mean by useful? In terms of function, accessibility, longevity. Very often there is something you can build as an engineer, but it's not marketable. Maybe it only, you build it and it would function, but it only functions for a week. Well, that's not something that's particularly useful to people. So, you might work in a physics lab and you've got to build a laser for a particular experiment, but once you operate that laser once, it burns itself out. And that's perfect for your experiment, but that's not something that's very useful to people because, it's probably very expensive and you can only use it once. So engineers not only have to think about the physical or natural processes, they also have to think about how they interface with people. So is this a product that is going to fulfill a need that for a very large or for a target audience? And that introduces a lot of trade-offs. So, I mean, that's the reason why a lot of our products, they might have funny little features in them, little ridges down the sides of them, whatever. And you wonder, what's that about? And you're like, well, in order to manufacture millions of these a year, they needed to use a particular process that happens to have this little artifact. And that artifact might make it a little less smooth to hold, but it allows them to produce a lot more of them. And so there's these very practical details that go into the engineering of these products. So yeah, largely application versus theories, like you guys were saying. And so we can think about that and say, okay, so for a chemical engineer, then it's sort of easy to kind of figure out where the theory is and where the application is. So a chemie is going to look at chemistry and use knowledge from a chemistry lab to build things that would not be in that lab, like, soap, toothpaste, a recycling process, and so on. So there's inferences here about how different things go together, what happens when they go together, and so on and so forth. That generates knowledge that the chemie has to understand that knowledge and then build products that have properties that are useful to people. So a chemie gets their knowledge from chemistry. Makes sense. An electrical engineer, similar sort of thing, gets knowledge from electricity and magnetism. So I was a double E, so you learn about Maxwell's laws. There's 4 of them. You learn about 1 per year. And then you end up getting kind of this background in E&M, and then you apply that to build things that don't look at all like the magic of E&M. So gain controllers, microprocessors, light bulbs, and so on. And this is just an application of those processes. Nothing you do here is telling you anything about that physical world, but the physical world that knowledge is needed in order to actually make these things work reliably over and over. So that brings up then the question, what is industrial engineering? So, what is the knowledge base that IEs pull from? Any thoughts about that? Is there a knowledge base? Yeah. So I hear a wide variety, mix of all. Yeah. Mixing from all the other engineering together. So again, that mixing together. I like these ideas. And I would even go so far to say there's a bunch of things that the other engineers don't have to worry about that the IE will have to worry about. There are certain human factors, people factors, that are not as involved in the design of these other products. So, we have to worry more about the psychology. How are people in that manufacturing system process that you've built? How are they going to respond to a particular change that you've made? Is it going to be efficient in the long run to have 100 people in the factory working this particular way when it's maybe not, cognitively ergonomic for each one of their stations to work the way it does? So maybe the IE has to consult psychology, whereas a lot of, there's no psychological engineering, at least not, there's psyops, but there's nothing that is like, in our traditional engineering that borrows directly from psychology, where we'd say, that's the scientific study of the human mind and so on. But we couldn't say that it's, going along with this mix idea, it's not only psychology that is there, because if we think about it, people don't exist in isolation in the systems that we work with. They exist with other people. So maybe we need not only just, your standard psychology, but also social psychology about how people work together when we're building these products that are surrounding them. But then, of course, we have to think about the products that we're building too. So you might be optimizing an intersection that has cars, that has people, that has technologies that have their own constraints and limitations. There are laws. So there are certain rules about where you can implement certain technologies and so on that go well beyond the knowledge base that you get out of the standard scientific literature. And as going back to this point about systems that was made earlier, once you combine these things together, sometimes it creates something new that there's absolutely no one out there that knows anything about. So in those cases, then we have to ask who is responsible for giving IEs the science, the knowledge base. And you kind of end up having to, so like if you want to build things like this, how do we build knowledge about these complex systems that are complex mixtures of humans and technology that do not exist anywhere else in the world? No one else has studied these combinations before. There is no textbook out there with a first law of manufacturing or something like that. And so who do we get that knowledge from? And if you think about it, really, we have to get it from ourselves. So that is, to me, the reason why an industrial and systems engineer is actually far closer to science than those engineers that have science in their names. A double E is not doing statistics. They'll take, they'll take a 380 or something like that. They'll learn about a t-test. They're not going to use a t-test, for the rest of their career there. If you ask them, why would you use a t-test? They might remember, a really good student might remember something they memorized, but when they actually are at, wiring circuits together and so on and so forth, they're not making inferences. They're not worried about gaining new knowledge. They're worried about building and then testing their designs. And that is a very different set of skills. Whereas, the industrial and systems engineer, they don't have that knowledge to lean on. So along with doing all the engineering stuff, they also have to design experiments, develop new models. And so that's something we have to talk about today, and then make inferences about how valid those models are. That's exactly what the scientists are doing. And so, industrial engineering is a mixture of kind of science and engineering, where you're sometimes going to be doing the standard optimization, building, et cetera stuff, but other times you before you can even start here, you're going to have to work here and build your own knowledge base up. And that is what I think is so great about industrial engineering, is that, it sounds like it's the most divorced from science, but the methods, I think, are the most compatible. So I would say there's far less of a difference between scientists and engineers when you're talking about IEs or ISEs. All right, any questions or comments on that point? Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say here? I hope you can see that as you look through your courses. We're trying to give you tools that don't necessarily help you sort of just memorize, all of these particular fundamentals from physics, chemistry, and so on. But we're trying to give you tools so that when you go into a new problem and people say, I'd like to do this thing, and you can then realize no one has ever done that thing before. How am I even going to try to figure out how to design something for that? Well, hopefully some of the tools that we give you in these courses help give you the ability to start building up a knowledge base that then you can use to help solve that problem. And so in order to do that, we have to build models. And so what are models? Well, when I say the word model, I think very often people get this, and it comes to mind. Fashion models. And I actually think we should be able to come up with a definition of a model that includes the things we build in this class, but also includes things like this. So with that in mind, why do we call these fashion models? What's the term model here doing? Any thoughts? Why are they fashion models? That comment was because they're showing the clothing on a person, because otherwise the clothing would just be sitting there flat. And so it's a representation of how it might look on another person, probably you. So that would be one reason we call them a fashion model. But that's, if we take that interpretation, which I really like, I mean, something else when you look at this, then you find that you're not only looking at the clothes, but you're looking at the people, and you realize that these two people, there's some odd things about it. For one, it's not a very diverse set. This is two separate images that are unrelated to each other, and they're both bent in the same way, which is kind of weird. Like, why would they be bent that particular way? He has probably got more product in his hair than I have, wear like in a week. And there's other things that may not actually be modeled here, like the glasses, for example. And so you see there's all these extra degrees of freedom that affect the way we look at this. Ultimately, we're told that we're just modeling the jacket. Like, we're selling the jacket, we're selling the dress. But ultimately, you see all of these other things, and you realize that some of the attraction to these things might be distracted by some of these other things here. So we have to be very careful when we build models, representations of the world, that like we can sell the idea to somebody, say like, I know you can't tell what this jacket will look like. Let me just find somebody to put the jacket on, and then you can sort of get a better idea of what it looks like on a person because you can't try it on yourself. That's a great idea. But then you have to say, which person are you going to put the jacket on? Well, it'd be nice if you put the jacket on somebody that's about my, height and weight, and not, this guy who's maybe half my weight, And so that would help me better understand, what that might look like on me. But because they put it on someone else, and I look at that and say, oh, I might like the way it looks on him, it may not look good on me. And we're going to see the exact same problem when we build simulation models. Similar with her in the dress. You can make the similar sorts of comments there. Likewise, the lack of diversity here. So these are clothes on, these white people, and there are certain color contrasts that maybe a different skin color would make these look very different. But if they can claim that, oh well, the fashion industry, these are just the models that we could find, then then they can kind of get away with it. But in reality, it may not be the most useful model. So as we'll see in a second here, our goal with models is not to create the best model. The best model might be me putting on the jacket, but that might not be possible. And even then, if I put on the jacket that particular day, I might just, I might lose a bunch of weight in a month or something like that. And then the jacket would look very different. So the goal is not to build the perfect model. The goal is to build the most insightful model to the target audience. And in these particular modeling applications, there is an incentive to sort of, the modeler might want to trick the audience. And hopefully, we as responsible engineers don't fall down that trap. All right, so with that in mind, here's a different model. This is an animal model. as my biologist colleagues would call it. So it is not sometimes your animal model, and it sounds like it might be a mathematical model of an animal, but no, this is the term that they use, that there's this, in this case, it's a mouse in the hand of a gloved laboratory hand here. And so why would we call this an animal model? So it sounds so it sounds like you said, then maybe it's like, what if you were interested in knowing how something, say a pharmaceutical, works in a human, and but you don't you it's not practical or not tractable or not feasible for you to actually test it in a human due to risk, and so you find a surrogate for the human, like this mouse, that and test it on the mouse and see how well it does on the mouse before you move up to humans. Am I summarizing? Yeah, that's definitely one way to think of it there. Any other thoughts on that? That makes sense, this idea of an animal model. So again, it's like a surrogate for the, in the fashion model case, I couldn't put on the jacket, so somebody else did, and I took a look at them with the jacket. But here you might say, well, there's a particular medication, or there's, let's say, it's not a medication, but let's say I just want to see the effects of sleep on learning and cognition. Well, I might, sleep deprive this poor mouse and then try to put it in a training exercise and then see how well it does if it's sleep deprived or not, and compare the two of them. And then I might make inferences about what sleep does in all vertebrates, in all mammals. And so that would be, a case there. But what are the risks of this approach? Right. So the comment there was there's differences between the mouse. So the mouse is built differently. So on one hand, it's a lot closer than, let's say, a cockroach. It's at least a vertebrate, at least a mammal, but it's a rodent. It does weird things with its teeth that humans don't do. It has a tail. It walks on all fours. It has a lot more fur. It's a lot smaller. There's all of these things that some aspects of the physiology probably work very similar than the physiology in a human, but other aspects are clearly different. And so how do you know when you get a result in the mouse that you can trust that that will generalize to the human? So that is something that you have to worry about there with this animal model. And other models. So this is the Bohr model of an atom. So, this model had a nucleus in the center and electrons kind of like planets orbiting around it. This was very useful when in early models of how the properties of matter worked, but it didn't quite explain all experimental observations. And so Bohr then developed an elliptical model, which you don't hear about as much, where the electrons go around in these ellipses instead of these circles. And it helped explain some deviations from observations in the laboratory, but again, wasn't perfect. And then cut to decades later, and you have this molecular orbital theory of these electrons that don't orbit, but they exist in these clouds of different shapes. Completely different model of an electron and an atom. And it was, also even more successful at explaining properties of matter. And then if we, instead of zooming out and think about matter properties like the properties of this table and how it feels and things like that, if we think about what's going on in the nucleus of an atom, then we have the standard model from particle physics, which an electron is built into here. And it explains properties that have to do with high energy physics of what goes on in that nucleus. And, there it is sort of exists in parallel with these models. And so sometimes they interact and sometimes they don't. But as we can see here, we've seen that the electron has been very different things at different times in history. And at any particular instant, there was a model of the electron that seemed to be pretty good and seemed to be good enough until a new model was found that displaced the old one. And so what I take from this, and what I'm hoping you'll see from this, is that in all of these modeling cases, it's not about finding the truth. In this case, I would claim that an electron does not exist. I would claim that it is just a useful modeling tool to explain the properties of matter. There could be an enterprising graduate student in physics, a couple buildings down from here, that is doing work trying to explain some deviation in some fine scale constant or whatever. And in her model, she manages to abandon the electron and take on something else. And if her model better predicts observational data, then in 10 years, we just won't teach people about electrons anymore. The electron will cease to exist because the electron we have to contend with all of the data that we have that's been consistent with this model of the electron, but we also have to realize that the electron has changed over time and it will continue to change. So it is not about figuring out what is actually in matter. We'll never know that, but we build better and better models that help us inform on how we interact with matter. So it's not about existence or truth or any of that. It's about utility. So models are not accurate. They're insightful. They're useful. That is kind of the key point here. And that's what we need to think about when you're building your models in Sim. You don't want to throw in everything with the kitchen sink just to make your model as realistic as possible, because once your models get too complex, then the model you build in the computer will be just as cryptic as the real world. So the goal isn't to make things match perfectly. The goal is to get an insightful hold on a system that by simplifying it in the computer, you can end up zooming in on certain processes that are going to be potentially useful to you as an engineer. So that kind of also brings me to think about Newtonian mechanics. Similar idea. Isaac Newton, when he came up with his theory of gravity, he punted. And you can actually read in the Principia that he sort of says, like, I'm going to do this GMM over R squared thing. I don't really have any better solutions. And really, I think it'd be philosophical for me to go any farther. But I realize that, I don't have any mechanism for gravity. I don't know how gravity works. So here's a formula. And there it goes. And just in general, there's a lot about Newtonian mechanics that once Einstein came around and gave us special relativity and general relativity, realized there were much better models that could explain precise differences from Newtonian mechanics. And so we could claim that Newtonian mechanics is all wrong. But if you talk to any of your aero friends, or actually systems engineers as well, who are building airplanes and things like that, they're not using relativity to build those airplanes. They're using Newtonian mechanics. So even though it's technically wrong, it's still, for the application spaces that we're working at, simple enough that it's actually more useful, because you can actually get really good solutions much more efficiently and economically than you could if you tried to use a more accurate model that maybe could get things to fine precision, where that precision of a solution you don't need for your design. So again, it's not about being right, it's about being useful. And that's something we have to think about when we build our sims. And that comes to this sort of famous quote from George Box. And a lot of people misunderstand this quote. George Box was a statistician. Box wasn't criticizing models. So a lot of people, when they read this, they might think, Box is saying, it's just the modeler out there. We hate modelers, yada, yada. That's not what Box was. A modeler. Box wasn't saying that. Box was saying that that you can't, well, in fact, I'll go to the next quote. His practical question was not how wrong, the question was not how to get them right, but how to make them useful. Or as he rephrased here, the practical question is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? At some point, your model will be overly simplistic, or it'll make assumptions that are so way off that it stops being useful. So if we go back to the fashion model example, if your body type is close enough to one of those two fashion models, then you're okay with it not being exactly like you. You can actually say, okay, yeah, I kind of have a good idea of what that jacket or that dress is going to look like on me. But for other people that are very different than that, they just have to throw the whole thing out and just say, I just need to find somewhere where I can try it on. So how wrong does the model have to be to stop being useful? That is the key question. And he goes on further and says, again, try not to spend too much time getting your models right. For such a model, there's no need to ask the question, is the model true? Truth will never be the whole truth. The only question of interest is the model illuminating and useful? So that's what we're going through here. So again, as you start building your models, don't think about, oh, I'm forgetting this particular thing that only happens Tuesdays at 3 p.m., but it sometimes does happen. And when it happens, sometimes the lines are a little bit longer in this particular process and so on and so forth. Maybe that thing doesn't matter for the question, for the problem that you're trying to solve. And in which case your model will be simpler, it'll be faster, it'll be easier to make sense of if you don't put that extra little bit of thing in. And that's something we'll be talking about throughout the semester. So this was a fortune cookie that I got once. Do not seek to find the answer so much as to understand the question better. And that, I think, is like all of science right there, is that it's not about finding the truth, it's about finding insightful ways to go about the world and to ask more questions that help us move on to find more knowledge and so on and so forth. All right, so if I wanted to like kind of summarize all of that up, what are models? My general definition of a model is anything that provides an answer to a what if question. So a fashion model, what if I wore that shirt? An animal model, what if I slipped, I went through sleep deprivation as a mammal? Anything that helps to answer that, we are going to refer to as a model. And so I think this is, I don't think this includes anything that I don't like calling models, and I think it includes everything that I do like calling a model. So far, I've been pretty happy with that definition. And so that's a definition that I want you to remember this term, what if. So any questions about that? All right, so with that in mind, let's try one of these clicker things. And so go ahead and I will open up a little short answer poll. And the question I'm going to ask you, and I'm just going to fill in a little short answer, is what is the question that models answer? So that'll be clicker one for this one. What is the question that models answer? Looking for a word, maybe two. And so, those of you who don't have the app downloaded, you can find it here. If you, it may take a while to download that, install, and log in. Otherwise, if you just go to this URL, student.iclicker.com, you should be able to find 475 there and take care of this. Does anybody else need more time? It's our first clicker. Yeah. It's still, the course doesn't pop up. Oh, did you try the join link from the announcement? All right, for any of you who have trouble with the join, just write your answer down to that. And I won't actually ask you to collect it on paper. Just for today, at least, at the end of this, not right now, but at the end of the class, email me your answers to these things. And then with that email, then I'll respond to that and we can work on seeing why you're not in the course. So if for some reason it's not opening for you, there are people it is opening in, right? Okay, great. So for anybody if for some reason you're not enrolled, just email me your answers sometime today, anytime's fine. And then that will also double as my reminder to see, make sure you've got the right link and if there's anything I can do to invite you specifically. All right. The question is, what is the question that a model answers? So my definition of a model is anything that helps to answer a question and what that blank is. A blank question. All right. So I'll go ahead and stop. All right. Okay. So types of models then. So there's a bunch of different types of models. We already went over some of them: fashion model, animal model. So if we will focus on the types of models that we're going to be using, we're going to get to sort of quantitative models is what we're kind of focusing on here. But still, there's a bunch of different things that I think fall under this kind of what if idea here. And so one of the things is statistical models. So, you can get a bunch of data. So here's data on high school GPA. Here's data on university GPA. Every point is a person. So this particular person had a low high school GPA, but a high university GPA. This person had a high high school GPA. So this person here, a high school GPA and a high university GPA, and so on here. And if I look at all of these data, then I can fit a regression line through that. And then that line and the slope of that line becomes a model. And so that model, based on data, is saying, what if someone had a 3.25 in high school, around where would we expect them to, what their GPA to be in college? What if they went to college? And then that red line would suggest, okay, it's about also 3.25. Now, we can challenge this model. We can say, whether this relationship is valid and all those sorts of things, and that's fine. But we'd still refer to this, the idea behind this red line is it's meant to allow you to answer the what if. And an individual data point only tells you about that person. If you project into the future and say, what if someone else with a different GPA that's not represented in these dots was to go there, that red line gives you a prediction of what they might get at the university. So that is what I refer to as what if. So statistical model is a what if helper that comes from looking for patterns in data. So then, let's get back to PowerPoint here. All right, and then graphical models, kind of a similar idea here. I like this one because this is like the idea here with, if you were doing an exercise experiment on someone, there's this theory that of oxygen consumption, basically at what point does your body start going into anaerobic metabolism. And so there's this idea that as your exercise intensity increases, your oxygen consumption is going to increase. That's the aerobic, it's you're getting energy through respiration. And at some point, though, the exercise intensity is so high that if you increase it even further, you don't see additional oxygen consumption. And so this OXPHOS pathway breaks down and other things start happening in your body in order to provide you the additional energy. And maybe they can only happen for a certain amount of time and so on and so forth. And so this is what I like about this graph is they even put these little red dots, which is like they're sort of saying, what if you ran an experiment? Well, if you ran an experiment, we would expect your data to be clustered around this black line. So it's like there's like two what ifs here. It's like the model just generally of, well, if this theory is correct, then for any exercise intensity, that we would expect that eventually you would hit a certain exercise intensity where things would level off. But then there's also this kind of what if to say that, oh, and if you didn't understand what I mean, then these little red dots would be like, if you were to run this experiment, we'd expect data to kind of cluster around there. So these graphical models are often going to be more illustrative than stating, your idea about VO2 max. Similarly, these predator-prey cycles. And so I can tell you that there might be certain environments where if you have predator and prey, you can get boom and bust cycles of the predator and prey as they interact, and that you might get what I'm saying, but it might be easier though if I show you a graph of that model where I'm saying, well, what if I had these rabbit and these wolves, and so let's say the rabbits are in blue, the wolf are in this green dashed line down here. Then when there's a low wolf population, you get an expansion of the rabbit population because there's no predators, at which point the wolves start eating the rabbits and they grow very quickly because there's lots of rabbits, which causes the rabbits to decline, which will then eventually cause the wolves to decline, and this cycles. And so the graphical model communicates everything I said before that, but I think it ends up doing it in maybe a more effective way. But it is still basically a model. It's a what if of, what if you introduced a predator and a prey and it was just the two of them together, what might occur? And this is one model of what could occur, these cycles. We can also talk about laboratory models, and we've talked about this a little bit already with an organismal model like this animal model. You can also have human models, and so so here's a human that is on a treadmill hooked up to respirometry equipment, and so gathering traces about her oxygen consumption and CO2 production. And we don't know what is going on here, but some people might say, well, if she's at the doctor's office, maybe she's not a model, because in that case, the doctor is trying to diagnose her. Maybe she's got a particular issue with her blood pressure regulation, or or something along that, orthostatic hypotension, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're trying to figure out, why she's fainting at certain times of day. And so they stress test her to figure out something about her. And you might say, if she is the one that you're making inferences about, then she couldn't be a model. But I would even challenge that to say, in the doctor's office, you're a very different person than when you're out, amongst the world. If you're outside, the temperature's hot, the sun is out, there's a lot of other people around, you're stressed about what you're doing, or maybe you're stressed in the doctor's office. So even here, this whole setup is a model of her when she's out doing her normal things in the day. And so it itself is probably not perfect. And so the results they get here might generalize to her everyday lived experience. But it might be there's some idiosyncrasies of the doctor's office that is, it's not going to work out. Or she might be in a laboratory study where they're studying, VO2 max in humans, for example. And so, she might, her data might be very similar to others that are of her same age, weight, built, and sex. But if all you had were people who looked like her on there, then maybe the data you get would be a poor fit to other sections of the population. So you always have to think about how that's why we get data and variation, lots of data and lots of variation, to sort of hope that we've got everybody in there. And so that's there's a bunch of things that could be going on there, but I would still argue that both of these are models, that at any time that you're making an inference about something else, like about something at a different time, at a different place, then the experiment that you're running is a model, because you're not at that time and place. You're trying to mimic that time and place. You're trying to represent that time and place. Even if it's with the same person, everything else isn't the same. So it's still a model to me. Are there any questions about that? Makes sense what I mean, that she is a model for herself. And then models in the wild, this is a traffic intersection. This is a nice image of, this is a particular place that has no stoplights, but you have a huge amount of traffic. And if you were before I saw this, if you were to say to me, if you went to a very high traffic, New York City style situation, and you just got rid of all the stoplights, then what would happen? Then my mental model of what would happen, my mind's attempt to do that what if, that's my mental model, I had to get a model to help me with a what if, would probably suggest that there would be mayhem, there would be gridlock, and so on and so forth. But when I see this, I have to update my mental model, because at least in this place, there's this interesting thing where there's this like eddy of cars that forms. It's not pretty. It's certainly doesn't appear to be efficient. There's room for optimization, but I don't see any wrecks. I see pedestrian traffic. I see bike traffic. And again, there's this sort of pod of these kind of a self-organized traffic circle that is sort of formed here. And it seems to kind of be interesting. So this suggests another alternative to that. This is a model. If there is a what if scenario, this helps answer there is a place out there where if you did this experiment, you wouldn't get gridlock. You would actually get something that had some degraded, maybe, but still functional behavior. And that I think is interesting. So you can absolutely have models in the wild. You can absolutely say, based on what happened at that intersection, we're going to make guesses at what's going to happen at this other intersection. And we see how generalizable. I mean, that's really the big question here. This is probably not a good model of an intersection here in Phoenix, but based on different kind of, in a different culture, people are brought up in a different way and they drive a different way, then maybe this just naturally happens. So along with that, models in the wild, we learn a lot from these accidents that happen. And so as engineers, every time we deploy a piece of technology, there is an opportunity for us to learn something. And we often learn something when disasters happen. And so in the Titanic sank, after they started to investigate it, they found out that actually it wasn't a very large glacier that the Titanic hit. It was in such cold water that the metal that they built the hull out of became super brittle. So even just a little bit of a collision would cause it to shatter. And that aspect of metallurgy was something that engineers at the time didn't know anything about. But the sacrifice of all of these people ended up causing them to start learning about that. And then they figured out that actually, if we want to build ships that go in these cold waters, then we need to figure out a different materials solution. So, they learned, this became a what if. What if you put this ship with this metal in that cold water and it hits something? That isn't an experiment that they wanted to do, but it's an experiment that was done. And that experiment, an experiment is a model, answered a what if question, and then that helped them refine their engineering practice. Now, the question here is, did these people give their informed consent? If I do an experiment funded by federal grants, I have to get a board at the university level to approve whenever I use humans, to make sure that those humans gave their consent to be included. But as engineers, you don't need to get people to give their consent. I mean, they bought the car, they got on the ship. Facebook, for example, does all sorts of experiments with people, giving people different prompts and seeing how they respond. People have no idea that they're involved in those experiments. And so, each one of those experiments is a model. Facebook is studying how you respond because they want to say, well, what if we do this more in the future? And they use your responses now in the little test setup to better understand that. So whenever you deploy any technology as an engineer, you're doing experiments, but you're doing them on people who don't realize they're in the experiment. And so that actually brings us to simulation. So it's nice for us to build artificial models, because if we can get some of these insights using a computer, then we don't have to unleash this technology onto the world until we're really sure that we've gained enough knowledge on this new system. Because as we said when we started, a lot of these systems don't exist before we build them. We just may not have any idea about how things are going to work until the rubber meets the road. And like I mentioned, rubber meets the road, and I think about like anti-lock brake systems is one example of that. When now if you hit the brake in your car really hard, you might hear a humming, like a and you might feel a vibration, and that is your brakes pulsing to prevent a slip condition, because you don't want your wheels to lock up and your wheels to just start sliding, because at that point you have no control over the wheels. So the anti-lock brake system pulses them so that it slows the car down just enough, but not so much that it starts slipping. Then it lets it go and then does that over and over again, does it very, very fast. When I grew up, we didn't have ABS. You had to learn how to do that with your foot. And so in driver's ed, it was very, you had to like practice, like, you put your foot down and you had to bring it up real quick, and, to try to keep doing the sliding. And people of a certain age were convinced that they could do it better than any engineered system. And so they didn't trust ABS. And so when ABS came out, then those people thought that they were right, because they noticed these ABS vehicles kept getting into accidents. So there's a much higher accident rate with cars with ABS than without. But when they actually looked at the data, they found out that the ABS cars were getting rear-ended, not going into front-end collisions. So they were actually stopping so fast that the people that were pumping their brakes couldn't stop fast enough and were running into them. So that was a case where ABS actually made the driver less safe because they would be more likely to get hit from the rear end until everyone had ABS. And now that everyone has ABS, then you're actually safer in these vehicles than we were before ABS. But that's an example that the engineers at the time didn't imagine that penetration mattered, how much it wasn't, they were building for one car, but they weren't thinking about the system of cars around them. And those collisions that happened educated them to say, wow, now when we implement these things, we really need to think about the system of how many other vehicles are on the road with similar technologies. And you're hearing those same conversations about autonomous vehicles now and so on and so forth. Like the future that people picture, the ultimately safe, transit and so on that's driven by computers or whatever, really depends on getting there. And getting there means going through a transition point where you have very low penetration of these technologies, and they may not work very well until there's a lot of them that are out there. So that's another example of, experimenting in the wild. Now, that ABS thing, that could have been done in a microscopic simulation of how these things work. We could have studied, if you've got 1,000 cars on a simulated California highway, how often do you get into wrecks with and without the ABS characteristics? But nobody did that sim. And so instead, the real world was the sim, and that's what people learned from it. So the other nice thing about doing the models in this, in a simulated platform is that, weirdly enough, reducing realism makes your models better in many cases. So rather than saying, here's a result that only works in Los Angeles, if you, instead of simulating all of Los Angeles, you simulate a generic city system, then you may not get a result that matches LA perfectly, but it is a much better match for LA and every other city. So taking details out of your model can actually make the models generalize more. And so that's another reason why we're not aiming to build the most complex models. We're aiming to build the models that include all of the salient features of the problem we're studying and hopefully no more. All right, so any questions about that point or these points? Does that make sense? It'll make more sense as we start building these models. But I just want to give a framework for, again, when I just start teaching about the sims, there's always these questions of, well, shouldn't you include this other feature, or shouldn't you include this other feature? And we actually want to build as few features into the sim as possible and only grow them when we absolutely have a reason to. And there's good reasons for that, as we'll see. All right, so the process as it goes, real world system, very complex. This is what we're studying. We have a certain mental model of how the system works. We try to put it down into a very simplistic artificial model, like a Monopoly board game. And by working with that model, then hopefully by putting all the salient features of this in to this simple model. So Monopoly is interesting, like it has a jail, but no police. Well, so Monopoly is really about how to run a real estate empire, and so it's important to know their rules, that if you break those rules, you go to jail. But all the details about who actually puts you in jail are not important to the model. So that's what I mean about only putting in the salient features. And by then running this simple model, which is very easy to run, you can play a game of Monopoly in an hour or something like that, then you get useful insight. Now, it isn't tailored to New York City or LA or London, but if you learn a little bit about real estate and you knew nothing about real estate, then you're a lot better off than you were to begin with. So that's one of the things that these simplistic models give us. The other nice thing the simplistic models give us is an easier way to communicate to others. So when I showed you that wolf and the rabbit example with a predator-prey model, that simplistic graphical model certainly wouldn't look like real data. Real data would be much uglier than that. But that simplistic model made it much easier for me to formalize an idea, to communicate that idea to you. And then you could say, now that I understand what you're talking about, I have this feedback. And then using your model as a touch point, as a boundary object, as something that brings us together, then I now also have a way to talk to you about my objections to your model, or what I think you should include or shouldn't include. So simplistic models help bring people together in the modeling process as well, which is another reason why we like to make them simple. We just have to make sure that our modeling assumptions that are realistic. It's not just about being too simple, but if you're sort of simple in the wrong way, then you can end up distracting and sending the wrong message. And so we'll talk a lot about that as we move on towards the back end of the course. All right, so more interaction here. So let's recognize your mental models. Those are kind of the most important models because that's from which we get all of these other types of models. So what do you see here when you look at this? What does your mind see immediately when you look at this pattern? Any thoughts? So how many triangles? Sorry. Two triangles. So I'm guessing you probably mean this triangle and this triangle. Yep. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. A star? Yeah. So you can see the star here, maybe kind of a six-pointed star. All right. Anybody else? Yeah. So three not full circles, and so sometimes I hear people say three Pac-Men, cartoon analogy there. But I like the idea of three circles not full because that maybe it suggests that there's three circles, but maybe going to the triangle idea, someone took a white triangle and set them on top of the circles, so you don't see all of the circles that are underneath it, and so on. Anybody else have any other thoughts? One semester, going off the Pac-Man idea, I had somebody say um, they had a whole narrative about there's three Pac-Men working as a team, and they were going into a shed that you couldn't see in, but there were ghosts in the shed, and they were going to work as a team to eat all of the ghosts, and that's what they got from this picture. So lots of, but what I like though about this is none of those things are actually here, right? I mean, there are no triangles. There's just line segments. This this white space is just white space. There's no edge or whatever. But your mind has a mental model which is trying to make sense of these things, and its mental model is answering these what if questions on what if I put a triangular block on top of these shapes, then would that match the data here? And if it, and so your mind's testing hypotheses and using models to do that. And then from that, you're telling me your hypotheses that have been tested in your mind, so you've got these mental models of how a world that could produce these data might work, and you're using those to make sense of that. Similarly, in this case here, what are some of the things that you see? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah, so this is sort of another one in narrative here. There's a man and there's someone maybe underneath the man trying to build a trap for this man that would cause him to fall into a hole. And what is the shape of that hole? Circle. I think most people would say a circle here. Um, some people, I mean, when I've asked these questions before, actually make some comments about the character of this man. They might say he's a snooty man, he's pompous, you don't like the man, but there's just squiggles on a page. There's no information about the character of this man. I mean, you make assumptions. What if I were to encounter someone like this? But you have these mental models that have preloaded all of this life experience that tell you things that are not on the page. Even this being a circle, this is longer than it is tall. So, it's not drawn as a circle, but we'd say, oh, but, Ted, if I looked at it at a certain perspective, then a circle would be distorted in this way. Well, an oval would be distorted from a different perspective. So, why are we assuming that the perspective that you chose, like that actually it's a perfect circle and not some, oval to begin with? So you have all of these hidden assumptions, these hidden models that are going on in your head that are useful to recognize. They help us, like when we look at this is sort of I think a famous piece of art that I think you can still find in the Louvre, but this up here says tandem convergent. This is the model for fiancés. Tandem divergent. This is the model for a couple just before a divorce. And so I think, I don't need to build the bike to know whether these bikes are going to work. And not only that, I can imagine in my mind, what if I built this bike? Well, if I built this bike and I tried to ride it, I wouldn't get anywhere because the two people would be sort of pushing against each other, wanting to move, but not being able to move. And then, that actually meets pretty well, like, the beginning of a relationship. You just want to be closer and closer to a person. And at the point, maybe before you get married, you can't actually be any closer. You're sort of stuck, even though you would like to be physically closer. And it's exactly the opposite just before the divorce. All you want to do is be rid of this person, but due to the fact that the divorce hasn't happened, then you have to still be around this person and be very close to this person. And so, it's using a bike model to model what ifs on how you feel. And that's, so there's like a whole lot there that is going on inside your head, mental models and making sense of this, which I think is really cool. And like, even if I show you a picture like this, we can think about how our mental models change over time. Initially, if you thought about this boat and I asked how to steer this boat, you might have some idea if you were to get in the boat if you wanted to turn left, whether you would push the rudder left or right. But then when you actually push the rudder in a certain direction, you might have guessed wrong. And almost immediately, you'll be able to update your mental model of what if I push the rudder left or right, what would happen to the boat? And if it flipped the other way, then you would flip things in your mind and then suddenly be able to steer the boat. So your mental models are accumulating experience over your whole life and then allowing you to use that experience to make sense of the world. And so sometimes that's useful and sometimes it's not. So there's this example that is sort of a famous example where they talk about a man and his son are driving the car one day. They get into a fatal accident. The man is killed instantly. The boy is knocked unconscious, but he's still alive. He's rushed to the hospital and will need surgery. The doctor enters the emergency room, looks at the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy. He is my son. Now, there are older audiences that cannot make sense of this scenario, but I'm guessing there are members of this audience that have a way to make sense of this. So what's going on here? What's a plausible scenario that could end this way? His mom, the doctor could be a woman. What's another plausible scenario? Any thoughts? I mean, another one thought is the doctor could be gay, right? So it could be a gay male or a female, but older audiences who grew up in a time where there was a more heteronormative where all doctors were men and there were sort of more heteronormative kind of cultural expectations, then if you grew up into that world, the what if model in your head is if I were to go into a hospital, all of the doctors would be straight men, and this would make no sense whatsoever. But, people who grew up in a different world have no trouble with that. They have a different mental model. And so that what if scenario is fine and they can solve that problem. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so, nobody's going to have a perfect model of a hospital in their head, but there's going to be some audiences where their models will be more useful than others. So you have to recognize all of these things that are going on in your head. And we'll be wrapping up here in just a minute. But the major strength is you do accumulate information over your life. And that's much more information we can ever load into a computer or a mathematics expression. But the downside is they're not generally good at handling complexity and dynamic change. And it's really difficult to communicate your models. Like if you were to ask somebody, well, how does a hospital work? to be able to get that out of your head, every aspect of it that's working in your head, is very difficult to do. So that's why we focus on quantitative models. So a quantitative model takes a little bit of that information out of your head and it puts it into a format that's much better at handling complexity and dynamic change and easier to communicate to others because it's in some sort of formal version. So this is a simple model of how disease spreads using three differential equations in a system. This is the so-called SIR model, which is a very famous model for understanding the basics of most disease, and then you can add a lot of specializations. And this, the downside of this is this sort of works in a cartoon epidemic, but it may incorporate very little information about, that people aren't in a well-mixed system. Not everybody can infect everyone else, and so on and so forth. So it leaves a lot out, but we can actually solve this problem, and we can actually point to the variables and communicate what they are. So there's trade-offs there for these quantitative models. This particular type of model is a model much more, it's this mathematical approach. This is more what you do in like 470. The downside is these mathematical approaches often can only solve things for a limited scope of the problems. Like in the SIR model, the mathematics are a little ugly to read, and they really only handle what happens as time goes to infinity. If you want to say, what does the disease progression look like over short time scales, then these become much more difficult to handle. So there are ways in which you can approximate them as numerical expressions in a spreadsheet that evolve over time and get graphs out. But now you abandon all of those expressions, and the best you can give somebody is a graphical model. And if you want to change how the model works, it requires updating a lot of expressions here. And so it ends up not being a very flexible tool. So the tool that we use in this class is simulation modeling, where our focus is modeling the processes that drive a system's behavior and using tools that make it very easy to adjust these processes as we learn more about the system. So it's very flexible, integrates a lot of different parts, is a good communication tool. The downside is we don't get any math out. There are approximate solutions. And because we depend on programs like Arena, FlexSim, and so on, our solutions will depend on assumptions that programmers made at one point in the development of the software. All right, so I don't want to keep us any longer than that. This is a good place for us to pick up from on Thursday, but I just want to give these reminders. So so again, do your unit 0, ICAA 2, the labs, you can work ahead, and then we'll do one last attendance exercise here, and so let's. I'll do another short answer where I'll say, let's say the question is, I'm drawing a blank. We'll say the question is, what is in one word or a couple of words, what is a key advantage of mental models over quantitative models? Why are mental models good over quantitative models? And they could answer that in one word or 2 words or a couple of words, but just basically that key point. And that's all I've got for you. So we'll see you Thursday. And for those of you, for some reason, iClicker's not working, then just follow up with me over email. We'll get you connected to iClicker and I'll get your attendance points recorded.